Aldrics True Heart. Washington, D.C., 1923. Margaret Collins watched as her shadow on an old parlor wall shifted to reveal a soldier's outline, bearing the unmistakable insignia of Captain Arthur Gray. Chapter 1. The shadow on the parlor wall. The late afternoon sun, a hazy orange orb sinking below the rooftops of Georgetown, cast long, distorted shadows across the parlor walls of Margaret Collins's modest, yet elegant, home. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a scene of unsettling tranquility, a stark contrast to the turmoil that churned within Margaret's breast. 5 years. 5 years since the armistice. 5 years since the world had supposedly exhaled, released from the grip of the Great War. Yet, here she was, still trapped in its suffocating embrace. She traced the outline of a shadow on the wall with a trembling finger. It wasn't her own. Not entirely. It was elongated, distorted, but undeniably him. The broad shoulders, the straight back, the slight tilt of the head as if perpetually listening for distant artillery fire. And then, the unmistakable detail, the faint, almost ghostly outline of a captain's insignia on the shoulder. Captain Arthur Gray. The man who haunted her waking hours and tormented her dreams. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her fingertips against her lids, trying to banish the phantom image. It was no use. He was everywhere, in everything. In the rustling of the autumn leaves outside her window, in the mournful chime of the distant church bells, in the very air she breathed. He was a ghost woven into the fabric of her existence. Foolishness, she whispered, her voice cracking with disuse. She hadn't spoken his name aloud in years. Not since that dreadful telegram had arrived, shattering her world into a million irreparable pieces. A sharp rap at the front door startled her. Margaret jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Composing herself with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to mask her emotions behind a veil of composure, she smoothed down the wrinkles in her simple, gray dress and went to answer it. It was Mrs. Abernathy, her neighbor, a stout woman with a perpetually worried expression and a penchant for gossip. "Margaret, dear, I saw the doctor's carriage pull away. Everything all right?" Her eyes, magnified behind thick spectacles, scanned Margaret's face with intrusive curiosity. Margaret forced a smile. "Just a routine checkup, Mrs. Abernathy. Nothing to worry about." It was a lie, of course. The doctor had been called for the recurring headaches, the dizzy spells, the relentless nightmares that left her drenched in a cold sweat, gasping for air. He had prescribed rest, fresh air, and a tonic that tasted suspiciously like laudanum. He hadn't prescribed a cure for a broken heart, for a soul riddled with guilt and regret. Mrs. Abernathy, thankfully, seemed satisfied with the explanation, though her eyes lingered on Margaret's pale face with a hint of suspicion. "Well, you take care of yourself, dear. These autumn chills can be treacherous. And," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "have you heard anything more about him?" Margaret stiffened. "Him?" she repeated, feigning ignorance. "Captain Gray, dear. There are whispers, rumors. Some say," Mrs. Abernathy leaned closer, her breath warm and smelling faintly of peppermint. "Some say he wasn't killed in action after all." Margaret's carefully constructed facade crumbled. The blood drained from her face, leaving her feeling faint and dizzy. That's impossible," she stammered, clutching the doorframe for support. "The War Department, the telegram," Mrs. Abernathy patted her hand condescendingly. "Telegrams can be wrong, dear. And the War Department, well, they're not always forthcoming, are they? Especially during wartime. Think of all the secrets, the hidden agendas. It wouldn't be the first time a man was declared dead when he was, shall we say, otherwise engaged." Margaret felt a surge of anger, quickly followed by a wave of nausea. "I don't believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "It's just cruel gossip." Mrs. Abernathy shrugged. "Perhaps. But I thought you should know. After all, you were close to the captain, weren't you?" Her eyes gleamed with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. Margaret closed the door, shutting out Mrs. Abernathy's prying eyes and unwelcome words. She leaned against the cool wood, her legs shaking, her mind reeling. Could it be true? Could Arthur be alive? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was a flicker of hope in the darkness, a dangerous spark that threatened to ignite a fire she had long thought extinguished. She walked back into the parlor, drawn to the shadow on the wall. It was still there, unchanged, unwavering. The captain's shadow. But now it seemed different somehow. Less ghostly, less menacing. More real. She remembered the last time she had seen him, standing on the platform at Union Station, his uniform crisp and new, his eyes filled with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had promised to write, to come back to her. He had kissed her, a brief, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and smoke and the promise of a future that never came. Arthur, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The name felt foreign on her tongue, yet familiar, like a forgotten melody suddenly remembered. A sudden, sharp pain pierced her temple, forcing her to cry out. She stumbled, clutching her head, and sank to the floor, the shadow of the captain looming over her, a silent witness to her unraveling. The room spun, the ticking of the clock faded, and the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of darkness and memory. She saw flashes of images, a muddy trench, a blood-stained letter, a whispered promise, a face contorted in agony. And then nothing. Only the lingering shadow remained, a testament to a love that refused to die, a mystery that demanded to be solved. The telegram. She needed to find that telegram. Chapter 2. Echoes of Amiens. The chill of the parlor floor seeped into Margaret's bones, pulling her slowly back from the abyss of unconsciousness. Her head throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that echoed the deeper pain in her heart. She lay there for a moment, disoriented, the lingering scent of beeswax and old paper filling her nostrils. The shadow was gone, replaced by the encroaching darkness of the evening. Pushing herself up, she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She steadied herself against a nearby armchair, its worn velvet upholstery offering a small comfort. Mrs. Abernathy's words echoed in her mind, a cruel whisper that refused to be silenced. Could Arthur be alive? The thought, once a distant, impossible dream, now took root, growing tendrils of hope and fear that intertwined and choked her. She had to know. She had to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The telegram. She needed to find the telegram. It was the key, the official confirmation of her loss, the document that had sealed her fate and condemned her to a life of quiet mourning. She had kept it, tucked away in a small, wooden box along with other mementos of their brief, intense romance, a handful of dried flowers from their picnic in Rock Creek Park, a faded photograph of them laughing together at a 4th of July celebration, a silver locket containing a miniature portrait of Arthur, his eyes gazing out at her with a mixture of love and longing. The box was in the attic, a dusty, neglected space filled with the detritus of her past. She hadn't been up there in years, not since she had packed away the remnants of her shattered dreams. Climbing the narrow, creaking stairs, Margaret felt a sense of trepidation. The attic was a repository of memories, a place where ghosts resided. Each step was a journey back in time, to a world before the war, before the telegram, before the shadow had consumed her life. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations from the rafters, and the only light came from a small, grimy window at the far end of the room. She shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She found the box tucked away in a corner, beneath a pile of old quilts. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, releasing the scent of dried lavender and the bittersweet aroma of lost love. She sifted through the contents, her fingers brushing against the familiar objects, each one a poignant reminder of what she had lost. And then she found it. The telegram. It was folded and creased, the paper yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. Her heart pounded in her chest as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the stark, official words, Regret to inform you Captain Arthur Gray killed in action Amiens October 26, 1918. Deepest sympathies. War Department. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Even after all these years, the pain was raw, visceral. She sank to her knees, clutching the telegram to her chest, tears streaming down her face. But then, something caught her eye. A small detail, almost imperceptible, that she had never noticed before. A faint smudge of ink near the date, as if someone had hesitated, corrected, or altered the original message. She held the telegram closer to the dim light, squinting her eyes. The smudge was definitely there, a deliberate alteration. And beneath it, she could just make out the faint outline of a different number. It wasn't an 8. It was A3. October 26, 1923. But that was impossible, 5 years after the war had ended. A wave of confusion washed over her, followed by a surge of adrenaline. Could the telegram be a forgery? A deliberate deception? But why? And who would go to such lengths to make her believe that Arthur was dead? Suddenly, a memory surfaced, a fleeting image from the chaotic days after the armistice. A conversation overheard at a Red Cross benefit, 2 men whispering in hushed tones about a sensitive mission, a necessary sacrifice, and a Captain Gray who was too valuable to lose. At the time, she had dismissed it as idle gossip, wartime paranoia. But now the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming a disturbing picture. Arthur hadn't been killed in action. He had been reassigned, hidden, used for some clandestine purpose. And someone, somewhere, had gone to great lengths to make sure she believed he was dead. The echoes of Amiens, the sounds of battle, the cries of the wounded, they were all a lie. A carefully constructed illusion designed to conceal the truth. But what was the truth? And where was Arthur now? She looked down at his picture in the locket, her fingers tightening on the cool metal, determination hardening within her. She had to find him. It has been 5 years of lies. Now, she would chase the truth. She would start with finding out what happened on that mission. Chapter 3. The Unsent Letter. The attic's gloom seemed to press in on Margaret, the weight of the revealed deception heavy on her shoulders. The altered telegram was clutched in her hand, a fragile piece of paper that held the key to unraveling a 5-year-old lie. She needed to leave this place, to escape the suffocating memories and breathe in the air of the present, however uncertain it might be. Descending the stairs, Margaret felt a newfound resolve. The grief she had carried for so long, the heavy cloak of mourning, began to lift, replaced by a flicker of anger and a burning determination. She would not be a passive victim any longer. She would be a seeker of truth, a hunter of shadows. Back in the parlor, she lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. She needed a plan, a starting point. The War Department was out of the question. They were the authors of the deception, the gatekeepers of secrets. She needed someone on the inside, someone who knew the workings of the military machine, someone who might have known Arthur, or at least known of him. Her mind went to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ashton, a friend of Arthur's from their days at West Point. They had served together in France, and Ashton had been a frequent visitor to her home before everything changed. He had been kind, supportive, a steady presence in the turbulent aftermath of Arthur's supposed death. She had always sensed a certain reserve in him, a hidden sadness that mirrored her own. Ashton. He was her best, perhaps her only hope. But approaching him would be risky. He was a career military man, bound by duty and loyalty. Could she trust him? Could she risk revealing her suspicions, her doubts, her fragile hope that Arthur might still be alive? She paced the room, her mind racing. She needed more information, something concrete to present to Ashton, something that would convince him to help her. The overheard conversation at the Red Cross benefit, the sensitive mission, the necessary sacrifice. It was vague, insubstantial, but it was all she had. Then she remembered something else. Arthur had always kept a journal, a small, leather-bound book where he recorded his thoughts, his observations, his fears. He had called it his companion in the trenches. He had never shown it to her, but he had mentioned it often, saying that it was his way of staying sane amidst the madness of war. Where was the journal? He wouldn't have taken it with him on a dangerous mission. It would have been too risky. He must have left it somewhere safe. Somewhere her eyes fell on the bookshelf, on the row of leather-bound volumes that Arthur had cherished. He had a particular fondness for military history, for the stories of courage and sacrifice that had shaped the world. She scanned the titles, her fingers tracing the spines. Caesar's Gallic Wars, Clausewitz's On War, Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And then she saw it, a slim, unassuming volume tucked between two larger books. It wasn't a military history book. It was a collection of poetry, Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Arthur had loved Whitman, had often quoted his poems about life, death, and the enduring spirit of humanity. She pulled the book from the shelf, her heart pounding. It felt heavier than it should. She opened it and a small, folded piece of paper slipped out. It was a letter, addressed to her, in Arthur's familiar handwriting. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the words were clear, powerful, filled with a love that transcended time and distance. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, it means I have embarked on a mission from which I may not return. I cannot tell you the details, only that it is of vital importance to our country, and that it requires the utmost secrecy. I know this is difficult for you, my love, but I beg you to trust me. Trust in our love, in our future, in the promise we made to each other. I know that the news of casualties can be wrong sometimes, and that they will most likely list me as one of them. Do not trust it. I swear I will be back. Know that every beat of my heart echoes your name, that every breath I take is a prayer for your safety and happiness. I carry your love with me, Margaret, a shield against the darkness, a beacon of hope in the storm. Wait for me, my love. Wait for me, and we will have our life together, a life filled with joy, laughter, and the enduring beauty of our love. Yours eternally, Arthur. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, tears of grief, of relief, of renewed hope. The letter was a confirmation, a validation of her deepest instincts. Arthur was alive. He had known he would be declared dead. He had anticipated the deception, the lies. And he had left her this message, a lifeline in the sea of uncertainty. He asked her to not trust the news of the war. She had a new direction and some hope to cling to. Now, she was sure. She was going to find him. Chapter 4. A Dance of Ghosts. The unsent letter, now a tangible link to Arthur, rested in Margaret's hands, its weight both a comfort and a burden. The words, penned in the shadow of war, resonated with a love that defied death and deception. It was a lifeline, a whispered promise across the years. She reread the letter, each word a spark igniting a fire within her. Wait for me. The phrase echoed in her mind, a mantra, a vow. She would wait, but she would not wait passively. She would search, she would uncover, she would bring him home. The first step was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ashton. She had to see him, to gauge his reaction, to discern whether he was friend or foe in this intricate game of secrets. The next morning, Margaret dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant navy blue dress, a color that projected both strength and sobriety. She pinned her hair up, a few stray strands escaping to frame her face, softening the determined set of her jaw. She needed to appear composed, confident, but not confrontational. She took a taxi to the War Department, the imposing building looming before her, a symbol of power and authority. The air was thick with the scent of car exhaust and the murmur of hurried conversations. Soldiers in uniform strode purposefully through the halls, their faces grim, their eyes focused on some unseen objective. Margaret felt a tremor of anxiety, but she pushed it down, reminding herself of Arthur's words, of his unwavering belief in their love. She approached the reception desk, her voice steady despite the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. I would like to see Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ashton, please. It's a personal matter. The receptionist, a young woman with a bored expression, eyed her skeptically. Do you have an appointment, ma'am? No, but it's urgent. Tell him it's Margaret Collins. He'll know who I am. The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone, murmuring a few words into the receiver. After a moment, she hung up.
He'll see you.
Room 312, third floor. Margaret thanked her and walked towards the elevators, her heart pounding. The ride-up seemed to take an eternity, the silence punctuated by the whirring of the machinery and the nervous tapping of her fingers. Room 312 was a small, nondescript office, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. Thomas Ashton stood by the window, his back to the door, his silhouette framed by the pale sunlight. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his hair streaked with silver. "Margaret?" he said, turning around. His voice was deep, resonant, but laced with a hint of surprise. What an unexpected pleasure. His eyes, a clear, piercing blue, studied her face, searching for clues, for answers. He had aged, but the kindness she remembered was still there, mingled with a weariness that spoke of battles fought and burdens carried. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need your help." He gestured towards a chair. "Please sit down. Tell me what's troubling you." Margaret sat, placing her handbag on her lap, her fingers clutching the strap. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "It's about Arthur," she said, the name a sharp pang in her chest. Ashton's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a guardedness, a hint of fear. "Arthur," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "What about him?" Margaret hesitated, weighing her words. She decided to start with the telegram.
"I found it," she said.
The telegram from the War Department. The one that said he was killed in action. Ashton nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember. A terrible tragedy. But it's not true, is it?" Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. The telegram was altered. The date it was changed. She saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He turned away, looking out the window, his profile silhouetted against the light. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and strained, "I understand your grief. It's been 5 years, but you need to let go. Arthur is gone." "No," she insisted, shaking her head. "He's not gone. He's hidden. He was sent on a secret mission, wasn't he? Something so important that they had to fake his death." Ashton turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and something else. Something darker, more dangerous. "Margaret, you're letting your imagination run wild. These are dangerous fantasies. You need to move on." Margaret pulled the letter from her handbag, her hand trembling. "He wrote me this," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Before he left, he knew they would declare him dead. He told me to wait for him." She handed him the letter, watching his face as he read it. His expression changed, the mask of composure slipping away, revealing the pain and conflict beneath. He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand clenching the letter. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with tears. "Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to say. "Tell me the truth, Thomas," she pleaded. "Please. I need to know where he is. I need to know if he's alive." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "He is alive," he said, the words barely a whisper. "But I cannot tell you where he is. It's classified. It's for his own safety, and for yours." A dance of ghosts, she thought, a waltz with secrets and shadows. But she was no longer afraid to dance. "Then I will find him myself," Margaret declared, meeting his eyes. Chapter 5. The Captain's Return. Ashton's revelation, though sparse in detail, was a thunderclap in the quiet room. Arthur was alive. The confirmation, spoken by a man who had shared the trenches with him, sent a wave of relief and renewed determination through Margaret. But his refusal to disclose Arthur's location was a wall, a seemingly insurmountable barrier. "You can't just tell me he's alive and leave it at that, Thomas," Margaret said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I've lived 5 years believing he was dead. 5 years of grief, of emptiness. I deserve to know more." Ashton ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, his face etched with weariness. "Margaret, I understand your pain, believe me. I was there. I saw things that no man should ever see. But I took an oath. I'm bound by duty, by secrecy." "Duty to whom, Thomas?" Margaret challenged. To a government that lies to its own citizens? To a war machine that chews up men and spits them out, leaving behind only broken hearts and shattered dreams? He flinched, his eyes clouding with a pain that mirrored her own. It's not that simple, Margaret. There are things at stake, things you can't possibly understand. National security, delicate negotiations, lives hang in the balance. Margaret stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. And what about my life, Thomas? What about Arthur's? Don't we deserve a chance at happiness? Don't we deserve to be together? He looked at her, his gaze filled with a mixture of pity and admiration. You're a strong woman, Margaret. Stronger than you know. But this is a dangerous path you're treading. You could be putting yourself and Arthur in grave danger. I'm not afraid, she said, her voice unwavering. I've lost everything once. I have nothing left to lose. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. I can't tell you where he is, Margaret. But I can tell you this. He's not in Washington. He's far away. And he's working on something that could change everything. Change everything? Margaret repeated, her mind racing. What does that mean? Ashton hesitated, then said, it's connected to the war, to the aftermath, to the unresolved issues, the betrayals, the secrets that haven't yet come to light. He paused, choosing his words carefully. There are powerful forces at play, Margaret. Forces that would do anything to keep those secrets buried. Forces that wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She suddenly understood the gravity of the situation, the danger that Arthur was facing, the danger she was now facing herself. But she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. I need to see him, Thomas, she said, her voice pleading. Just once. To know that he's all right. To tell him that I still love him. Ashton looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I can't arrange a meeting, Margaret. It's too risky. But perhaps there might be a way for you to send him a message. A letter. A flicker of hope ignited within her. A letter?
How?
There's a contact, Ashton said, his voice low. Someone who has access to Arthur. Someone who can deliver a message discreetly. But it has to be done carefully without attracting attention. He gave her a name and an address, a small, unassuming shop in a quiet corner of Georgetown.
Go there, he said.
Ask for Mr. Silas. Tell him that Thomas Ashton sent you, and that you have a message for the captain. Margaret committed the name and address to memory, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Thank you, Thomas, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for telling me this. He nodded, his face still grim. Be careful, Margaret, he warned. This is a dangerous game, and you're playing against some very powerful players. Margaret left the War Department, her mind reeling. The city streets seemed different now, filled with shadows and whispers, with hidden dangers and unseen eyes. She felt a sense of vulnerability, but also a sense of purpose. She was no longer alone in her quest. She had a lead, a contact, a glimmer of hope. That evening, back in her parlor, Margaret sat at her writing desk, a blank sheet of paper before her. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, her hand trembling slightly. What to say to the man she had loved and lost, the man who was now a ghost returned from the shadows. How to express the years of grief, the longing, the unwavering love that had survived the lies and deception. She began to write, the words flowing from her heart, a torrent of emotions unleashed after years of silence. She told him everything about the altered telegram, about Mrs. Abernathy's whispers, about her meeting with Ashton. She told him about her pain, her confusion, her unwavering belief in their love. She wrote late into the night, the lamp burning low, the shadows dancing on the walls. And as she wrote, she felt a sense of peace, a sense of connection to Arthur, a feeling that he was there with her, in the room, in her heart. She sealed the letter, addressing it simply to the captain. It was a risk, a gamble, but it was the only way. She would deliver it to Mr. Silas tomorrow and pray that it reached its destination, that it found its way to Arthur, wherever he might be. As she prepared for bed, A sudden noise startled her. A creaking sound from the hallway. She held her breath, listening. Silence. Just the old house settling, she told herself. But a sense of unease lingered, a feeling that she was being watched. That the game she was playing was far more dangerous than she realized, and she was outmatched. The next morning, there was a knock at the door. Her heart jumped. It was too early for Mr. Silas. Could it be? She opened the door, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing on her doorstep, his uniform slightly dusty, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and weariness, was Captain Arthur Grey. He was real. He was there. Chapter 6. Whispers in the Gallery. The sight of Arthur standing on her doorstep, 5 years after she had believed him dead, struck Margaret speechless. He was both familiar and foreign, the man she remembered, yet subtly altered by time and experience. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by hardship and perhaps sorrow. His jaw was firmer, his gaze more intense, holding a hint of the battles he had fought, both seen and unseen. But his smile that was the same, a beacon of warmth that cut through the years of separation and doubt. "Margaret," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. He didn't step inside, didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, as if waiting for permission, for a sign that he was welcome. "Arthur," she finally managed to whisper, her voice choked with emotion. Is it really you?" He nodded, a slight movement of his head. "It's me, Margaret. I'm here." She stepped aside, her hand gesturing towards the interior of the house. "Come in," she said, her voice trembling. "Please come in." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped across the threshold, his presence filling the small hallway. He seemed taller, broader, more substantial than the ghost she had carried in her memory. The scent of him, a mixture of leather, tobacco, and something indefinably him, filled her senses, overwhelming her. She closed the door, shutting out the world, creating a small, private space where they could finally confront the years of silence, the lies, the unanswered questions. "I don't know what to say," she stammered, her hands fluttering nervously. "I thought you were dead." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm, real, a tangible connection that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I know," he said, his voice soft.
I'm sorry, Margaret.
"I'm so sorry for everything." Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of anger. "Why, Arthur?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did they lie? Why did they make me believe you were gone?" He sighed, his hand dropping to his side. "It's a long story, Margaret. A complicated one. But I promise I'll tell you everything. Just not here."
Not now.
His eyes scanned the room, a hint of unease in their depths. "We're not safe here, Margaret. We need to go somewhere private, somewhere we can talk without being overheard." She nodded, understanding dawning on her. She had known this was a dangerous game, that there were powerful forces at play. She had been prepared to risk everything to find him, and now she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Where should we go?"
she asked.
He thought for a moment, then said the National Gallery. "There's a small, secluded gallery on the 2nd floor, overlooking the gardens. It's usually empty this time of day. We can talk there." The National Gallery. A place of art, of beauty, of quiet contemplation. A place where they could hide in plain sight, surrounded by masterpieces, yet isolated in their own private world. They left the house separately, taking different routes, a precaution against being followed. Margaret felt a sense of heightened awareness, her senses on alert, scanning the streets for any sign of danger. The city, once familiar and comforting, now seemed filled with hidden threats, with unseen eyes watching their every move. They met at the designated gallery, a small, octagonal room with high ceilings and large windows overlooking the lush greenery of the gardens. The only other occupant was an elderly woman sketching a statue in a corner, seemingly oblivious to their presence. Arthur led Margaret to a bench beneath one of the windows, the sunlight streaming in, illuminating their faces. They sat in silence for a moment, simply looking at each other, absorbing the reality of their reunion. "Tell me," Margaret said, her voice low but firm. "Tell me everything." Arthur took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the gardens below. "It started in Amiens," he began, his voice a low murmur. "The mission, it wasn't what they told you. It wasn't a routine patrol. It was a retrieval. We were sent to recover something of vital importance." He paused, his brow furrowed. "It was a document, Margaret. A treaty. A secret agreement between certain factions within the Allied forces. An agreement that, if revealed, could have shattered the alliance, prolonged the war, changed the course of history." Margaret's eyes widened. A secret treaty? What kind of agreement? "It involved concessions," Arthur said, his voice strained. "Territorial concessions, economic concessions, betrayals, Margaret. Betrayals of promises made, of principles violated. It was a dirty game, played by powerful men with their own agendas." He continued, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and disillusionment. He described the mission, the dangers, the betrayals he had witnessed. He told her how he had secured the document, how he had been pursued, how he had been forced to go into hiding, to assume a new identity, to disappear from the world. "They couldn't risk me talking," he explained. "They couldn't risk the treaty being exposed.
So they faked my death.
They made me a ghost." "And the 5 years? What happened?" Margaret probed, gently. He ran a hand through his hair, and for the briefest second, he resembled the haunted young man he had been. Living in the shadows. Constant movement. Never truly safe. It was the only way they said I could be safe. But Thomas. He knew. Didn't he? "Thomas was my only lifeline," he said, a small smile gracing his lips. "He was the one who orchestrated this meeting, wasn't he?" Margaret nodded, explaining how she found the original telegram and how she found his letter. "I knew you would," he whispers to her. "My clever Margaret. Now what will you do?" "I will be with you, where I should have been all along," she answered. Chapter 7. The Price of Silence. Arthur's revelation about the secret treaty and his forced disappearance cast a long shadow over their reunion. The joy of being together again was tempered by the knowledge of the dangers they faced, the powerful forces arrayed against them. The whispers in the gallery had unveiled a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of power, a web of deceit that threatened to ensnare them both. "So, what happens now?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The elderly woman in the corner had left, leaving them completely alone in the secluded gallery. Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "We have to be careful, Margaret. Very careful. They know I'm alive. They know you know. We're both targets now. But what can they do?" she asked, a tremor of fear creeping into her voice. "The war is over." "Surely," he shook his head. "The war may be over, but the battles continue. The struggle for power, for control, it never ends. And this treaty, it's a weapon, Margaret. A weapon that can be used to destroy reputations, topple governments, to ignite new conflicts." He explained that the factions involved in the secret treaty were still active, still vying for influence. They had a vested interest in keeping the document hidden, in silencing anyone who knew its contents. "We need to get it out," Arthur was saying, his gaze never leaving her. "We need to bring it into the light of day. Let the world know, so that they can't hurt anyone with it anymore." Margaret nodded, her face pale. "The treaty, where is it?" Arthur hesitated. "It's safe," he said. "Hidden. But getting it will be dangerous. I need to retrieve it, and I need to do it alone." "No," Margaret protested, her voice sharp. "I won't let you go alone. I've lost you once, Arthur. I won't lose you again." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, reassuring. "Margaret, I understand your fear, but this is something I have to do. It's my responsibility. I was the one who retrieved it. I'm the one who has to bring it to light." "But no buts," he said, his voice firm, but gentle. "I need you to be safe, Margaret. You're my strength, my anchor. I need to know that you're here, waiting for me. That's what will keep me going." She knew he was right. She couldn't risk jeopardizing his mission, couldn't risk putting him in further danger. But the thought of being separated from him again, even for a short time, was unbearable. "Promise me," she said, her voice trembling. "Promise me you'll come back to me." He squeezed her hand, his eyes locking with hers. "I promise, Margaret. I swear on my life, on our love. I will come back to you. We'll have our life together, a life free from shadows, free from fear." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating as one. The sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating their faces, casting a golden glow on their intertwined hands. "There's something else," Arthur said, his voice low. "Something I haven't told you." Margaret looked at him, her eyes questioning. "The treaty, it's not just about political maneuvering," he said. "It's personal. It involves my family." Margaret's eyes widened. "Your family?
How?"
He explained that his father, a prominent diplomat, had been involved in the negotiations, had been one of the architects of the secret agreement. But he had also had a change of heart, had realized the devastating consequences of the treaty, had tried to expose it. They silenced him. "Margaret," Arthur said, his voice filled with anger and grief. "They made it look like an accident, a tragic accident. But it was murder. They murdered my father to keep him quiet." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Arthur, I'm so sorry." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's why I have to do this, Margaret. Not just for the world, but for my father. For justice. For his memory." The price of silence, she realized, was far greater than she had imagined. It was measured in lives, in shattered families, in the corrosive power of secrets. "I understand," she said, her voice firm. "I'll help you, Arthur. In any way I can." He smiled, a faint, weary smile. "Thank you, Margaret. That means everything to me." They made a plan. Arthur would retrieve the treaty, while Margaret would stay in Washington, gathering information, finding allies, preparing for the moment when they could expose the truth. It was a dangerous gamble, a race against time, but they were determined to win. They would fight for justice, for their future, for the love that had endured the darkness and emerged, stronger and more resilient than ever before. She just had to figure out where to start. "Meet me here, same time, 2 days from now," Arthur proposed, and Margaret could not help but agree. She only had to find information, and fast. Chapter 8. Beneath a Wounded Sky. The 2 days following Arthur's clandestine return stretched into an eternity for Margaret. She moved through her routines like a ghost, her mind consumed with a perilous task ahead. The city, once a familiar backdrop to her quiet life, now pulsed with hidden menace, every shadow seeming to conceal a potential threat. She knew she needed to gather information, to find allies who could help them expose the truth about the treaty. But where to start? The War Department was out of the question, a den of vipers. Thomas Ashton had provided the initial spark, but he was bound by his oath, his hands tied. She considered reaching out to journalists, to newspapers that might be willing to publish the story. But that was a risky proposition, a potential death sentence. The conspirators had powerful connections. They could easily silence any media outlet that dared to challenge them. Then, she remembered Senator Elias Thorne, a man known for his integrity, his unwavering commitment to justice, and his outspoken criticism of government corruption. He was a long shot, a powerful man with powerful enemies, but he was also a man of principle, a man who might be willing to take a stand. She had met him once, briefly, at a social gathering before the war. He had been charming, intelligent, and deeply concerned about the direction the country was taking. She remembered his words, his passionate plea for transparency, for accountability, for a government that served the people, not the powerful. She decided to write him a letter, a carefully worded plea for help, outlining the situation, the secret treaty, Arthur's forced disappearance, and the threat they faced. She didn't reveal all the details, just enough to pique his interest, to convince him to meet with her. She hand-delivered the letter to his office, a grand, imposing building near the Capitol. She felt a tremor of anxiety as she handed it to the receptionist, a stern-looking woman with a suspicious gaze. She knew she was taking a risk, exposing herself to potential danger, but she had no other choice. The waiting was the hardest part. Days turned into nights, the silence punctuated by the ticking of the clock and the distant sounds of the city. She jumped at every phone call, every knock at the door, her nerves frayed, her sleep disturbed by nightmares. Then, on the second day, just hours before she was supposed to meet Arthur at the National Gallery, she received a reply. A short, terse note requesting her presence at Senator Thorne's private residence that evening. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but elegant dress, a color that projected both confidence and vulnerability. She needed to appear credible, trustworthy, a woman worthy of his attention, his help. Senator Thorne's residence was a stately mansion in Georgetown, a world away from her modest home. The air was thick with the scent of old money, of power and privilege. She was ushered into a richly appointed study, lined with bookshelves and antique furniture. Senator Thorne rose to greet her, his tall, imposing figure dominating the room. He was older than she remembered, his hair silver, his face lined with the burdens of his office. But his eyes, a sharp, piercing blue, were still filled with the fire of conviction, the unwavering commitment to justice. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Your letter was intriguing. Please tell me more." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She told him everything, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She described Arthur's mission, the secret treaty, his forced disappearance, and the threat they faced. She showed him Arthur's letter, the proof of his existence, his unwavering love. Senator Thorne listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked probing questions, challenging her assumptions, testing her resolve. He was a shrewd, experienced politician, a man who had seen it all, a man who knew how to separate truth from fiction. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "Miss Collins," he said, his voice grave. "I believe you. I believe your story. And I believe this treaty, it's a danger to our nation, to our democracy." Relief washed over Margaret, a wave of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Senator," she said, her voice choked with emotion.
Thank you for believing me.
He nodded, his face set with determination. "I'll help you, Miss Collins. I'll do everything in my power to expose this conspiracy, to bring these criminals to justice. But it won't be easy. It will be a long, arduous battle, and we'll be facing some very powerful enemies." "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not afraid." He smiled, a faint, weary smile.
"Good.
"Because we're going to need all the courage we can muster." As she was preparing to leave, the sky outside took on a strange tint. The clouds rolled in from the west, looking bruised and heavy. The light in the room changed, and shadows lengthened as the storm gathered strength. It mirrored the weight of the information and the battle ahead of them. She knew, but Margaret felt bolstered, strengthened by the presence of an ally. She felt confident for the first time in a long time. She could take on the storm. She left the senator's residence, the wind whipping her hair, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. The sky was wounded, bleeding a bruised purple and gray, but beneath it, Margaret felt a flicker of hope, a spark of defiance. She was no longer alone. She had an ally, a powerful ally, and together, they would fight for justice, for truth, for a future free from shadows. As she looked towards the sky and made her way to the gallery, a crack rang out, followed by the low roll of thunder. Chapter 9. The Telegram's Sting. The storm that had been brewing during Margaret's meeting with Senator Thorne broke with full force as she arrived at the National Gallery. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howled like a banshee, and the sky was a swirling vortex of dark, ominous clouds. It was a fitting backdrop to the turmoil in her heart, the anticipation and anxiety that churned within her. She found the secluded gallery empty, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. She paced nervously, her eyes scanning the entrance, her heart pounding with each passing minute. Arthur was late. She tried to reassure herself. He had warned her that retrieving the treaty would be dangerous, that there might be delays. He was a resourceful man, a skilled operative. He knew how to survive. But the fear, the gnawing doubt, refused to be silenced. She clutched the small, silver locket containing his portrait, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of his face. It was a talisman, a reminder of his love, his promise. She whispered his name, a prayer, a plea for his safety. The minutes stretched into an hour, the hour into two. The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within her. The gallery, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, a cage of anticipation and dread. Just as she was about to give up hope, to succumb to the despair that threatened to engulf her, she saw him. He appeared at the entrance to the gallery, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He was drenched, his clothes plastered to his body, his hair matted with rain. But he was alive. She rushed towards him, her heart soaring with relief. "Arthur," she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "You're here. You're safe." He reached for her, his hands gripping her arms, his eyes searching her face. He looked exhausted, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and something else. Something that sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. "Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse. I have it. The treaty." He reached inside his coat, pulling out a small, waterproof packet. It was sealed with wax, bearing the faint imprint of a crest, a symbol of the conspiracy that had haunted their lives. "Thank God," she whispered, her hand reaching out to touch the packet. "You did it, Arthur. You actually did it." But he didn't smile. He didn't share her relief, her joy. His eyes were clouded with a darkness she hadn't seen before, a shadow that chilled her to the bone. "But?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What is it, Arthur? What's wrong?" He looked at her, his gaze unwavering, his expression grim. "There's been a complication," he said, his voice low. "A betrayal." Her blood ran cold. "Betrayal? What do you mean?" He hesitated, then said, "It's Thomas."
Lieutenant-Colonel Ashton.
He wasn't who we thought he was. Margaret's mind reeled. Thomas? The man who had helped them, who had given her hope, who had seemed to share their grief, their desire for justice? It couldn't be true. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's impossible. He helped us. He told you where to find the treaty." "He played us, Margaret," Arthur said, his voice filled with anger and bitterness. "He set a trap. He knew I would go for the treaty, and he was waiting for me." He described the encounter, the ambush, the desperate fight for survival. He had managed to escape, to retrieve the treaty, but not without a cost. "He sent me a message," Arthur said, his hand reaching into his pocket. "A telegram." He handed her the telegram, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The words were stark, cruel, a dagger to her heart. "Game over. You lose. Tell Margaret I win. Ashton." Margaret gasped, her knees buckling beneath her. She sank to the bench, clutching the telegram, her mind numb with disbelief, with the crushing weight of betrayal. He knew about us," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "He knew everything." Arthur knelt beside her, his arm around her, his presence a small comfort in the face of overwhelming despair. "He was playing both sides, Margaret," he said, his voice filled with a weary resignation. "He was working with them, with the conspirators. He was using us, using our trust, our love, to get to the treaty." The telegram's sting was not just the message, but the confirmation of their vulnerability, of the intricate web of deceit that surrounded them. They had been pawns in a larger game, manipulated by a man they had trusted, a man who had betrayed them both. Margaret looked up at the stormy sky outside the gallery. She didn't know where to go, or who to trust. He was supposed to be the ally, the good one, the one who could lead them out.
Now he was hunting them.
They were on their own. The weight of it all was crushing. The sky wept. Chapter 10. A broken vow. The gallery, once a haven, now felt like a mausoleum, the echoes of Ashton's betrayal reverberating through the silence. The rain had subsided, leaving a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, a mirror of the despair that gripped Margaret and Arthur. The telegram lay on the bench between them, a venomous serpent coiled and ready to strike again. "We need to leave," Arthur said, his voice urgent. "He knows we're here."
He could be on his way.
Margaret nodded, her mind struggling to process the devastating revelation. Thomas Ashton, the trusted friend, the confidant, the supposed ally, a traitor. It was a blow that shattered her faith, her belief in the goodness of people. They left the gallery, moving quickly and cautiously, their eyes scanning the hallways, the entrances, for any sign of pursuit. They felt like fugitives, hunted and alone, their trust betrayed, their future uncertain. They took a circuitous route back to Margaret's house, avoiding main streets, sticking to alleyways and back lanes. The city, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and threatening, a labyrinth of hidden dangers. Once inside, they locked the doors, drew the curtains, creating a small, enclosed world, a temporary refuge from the storm outside. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, the weight of their predicament pressing down on them. "I don't understand," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Why, Arthur? Why would Thomas do this? He seemed to care about us." Arthur sighed, his face etched with weariness. "I don't know, Margaret. I've been asking myself the same question. Maybe it was money, power, ambition, maybe he was always one of them, a double agent from the start." He paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. "I trusted him, Margaret. I confided in him. I shared my fears, my hopes. I even told him about my father, about the treaty." "It's not your fault, Arthur," Margaret said, reaching out to him. "You couldn't have known. He fooled us both." He stopped pacing, his gaze meeting hers. "But I should have known," he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. "I should have seen the signs, the subtle hints, the inconsistencies. I was blinded by my own grief, by my desire to believe in him." Margaret went to him, putting her arms around him, holding him close. "Don't blame yourself, Arthur," she said, her voice soft. "We were both victims of his deception. We were both betrayed." They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other, finding solace in their shared pain, their shared love. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a steady rhythm in the midst of chaos. "We need a new plan," Arthur said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "We can't trust anyone. We're on our own." Margaret nodded, her mind racing. Senator Thorne. He was their only remaining hope, their only potential ally. But could they trust him? After Ashton's betrayal, she was wary of putting her faith in anyone. "We need to reach out to Senator Thorne," she said. "He's the only one who might be able to help us. But we need to be careful. We can't let him know where we are." Arthur agreed. They decided to send a coded message to the senator, arranging a meeting at a neutral location, a place where they could be sure of their safety. They would use a cipher, a secret code that only they knew, a language of love that they had developed during their brief, intense romance before the war. They spent the next few hours crafting the message, carefully choosing each word, each symbol, to convey their urgency, their desperation, without revealing their location or their plans. It was a delicate dance, a balancing act between trust and caution. As they worked, Margaret couldn't shake the image of Thomas Ashton from her mind. His face, once so familiar and reassuring, now seemed like a mask, a cruel disguise that concealed a treacherous heart. She remembered a conversation they had had, shortly after Arthur's supposed death. Ashton had come to her house, offering his condolences, his support. He had spoken of Arthur with admiration, with respect, with a hint of envy. "He was a good man, Margaret," Ashton had said. "A brave man. He deserved a better fate." He had then placed a hand on her arm, his touch lingering a moment too long. "You deserve better too, Margaret," he had said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. "You deserve to be happy." At the time, she had dismissed it as a clumsy attempt at comfort, a misguided gesture of sympathy. But now, looking back, she saw it in a different light. It was a subtle advance, a veiled declaration of his own desires, his own ambition. He had wanted her. He had wanted Arthur's life, his reputation, his place in the world. He had seen the treaty as a way to achieve his goals, to eliminate his rival, to claim his prize. The broken vow, she realized, was not just Arthur's vow to return to her. It was Ashton's vow of friendship, of loyalty, of honor. He had broken all of them, betraying not only Arthur and Margaret, but his own country, his own principles. The realization fueled her anger, her determination. She would not let him win. She would fight for justice, for Arthur, for their future. She would expose his treachery. She would bring him down. She and Arthur finished encoding the message. The only thing was to get the message to the senator. She couldn't be seen, and neither could Arthur. How could they outsmart Ashton when he seemed to always be one step ahead? The plan had to be perfect. Chapter 11. The Serpent in the Garden. With the coded message to Senator Thorne prepared, the challenge remained: how to deliver it without exposing themselves to Ashton's surveillance. They knew he would be watching them, anticipating their every move. A direct approach was out of the question. Margaret paced the parlor, her mind racing. They needed a proxy, someone inconspicuous, someone who wouldn't arouse suspicion. But who could they trust? Every friend, every acquaintance, seemed like a potential informant, a pawn in Ashton's game. Then, she remembered Mrs. Abernathy, her nosy, gossipy neighbor. The woman who had unwittingly planted the seed of doubt about Arthur's death. The woman who seemed to know everything that happened on their quiet street. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Mrs. Abernathy was a nuisance, a meddler, a woman who thrived on rumor and speculation. But she was also, in her own way, harmless. She was a creature of habit, a predictable presence in the neighborhood. And, most importantly, she was unlikely to be connected to Ashton or his network. Mrs. Abernathy, Margaret said, turning to Arthur. We could use her to deliver the message. Arthur looked at her, his eyebrows raised. Your neighbor? The one who? Yes, Margaret said, a faint smile playing on her lips. She's the perfect candidate. She's nosy, she's always out and about, and she's completely oblivious to the world of espionage and secret treaties. Arthur chuckled, a rare sound that eased the tension in the room. It's audacious, he said. It might just work. They devised a plan. Margaret would write a seemingly innocuous note to Senator Thorne, a simple thank you for his recent speech on Veterans Affairs, a topic that Mrs. Abernathy was known to be passionate about. She would then accidentally drop the note while visiting Mrs. Abernathy, knowing that the woman's curiosity would get the better of her. Mrs. Abernathy, being a patriotic woman, would undoubtedly deliver the note to Senator Thorne's office, believing she was doing her civic duty. The coded message, concealed within the seemingly innocent text, would reach its destination, undetected by Ashton's watchful eyes. The next morning, Margaret put the plan into action. She dressed in her everyday clothes, a simple dress and a worn coat, making herself appear as unremarkable as possible. She walked to Mrs. Abernathy's house, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She found Mrs. Abernathy tending to her small front garden, her hands covered in dirt, her face beaming with pride at her blooming chrysanthemums. The garden, a riot of color and fragrance, seemed like an oasis of normalcy in a world turned upside down. Good morning, Mrs. Abernathy, Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. Your flowers are lovely. Mrs. Abernathy straightened up, her eyes widening behind her thick spectacles. Margaret dear, what a surprise. And yes, my chrysanthemums are doing particularly well this year. It's the mild autumn, you know. They chatted for a few minutes about the weather, the neighborhood gossip, the latest pronouncements from Washington. Margaret subtly steered the conversation towards Senator Thorne, mentioning his recent speech, praising his dedication to veterans. I was so moved by his words, Margaret said, feigning admiration. I wrote him a little note, just to thank him. I'm not sure if I should send it though. He must have so much to handle. She pulled the note from her pocket, pretending to hesitate. She then accidentally dropped it, letting it flutter to the ground near Mrs. Abernathy's feet. Oh, dear, Margaret exclaimed, feigning embarrassment. How clumsy of me. Mrs. Abernathy, as expected, bent down to pick it up. Her eyes scanned the note. Her curiosity piqued. "Senator Thorne?" she said, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and importance. "You wrote to Senator Thorne?" "Yes," Margaret said, shrugging. "Just a little thank you note. Nothing important." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes gleamed. "Well, I'm sure he'd appreciate it, dear. It's always nice to know that our elected officials are appreciated. In fact, I'm heading downtown later today. I could drop it off at his office for you. Save you the trip." Margaret pretended to hesitate, then said, "Oh, would you, Mrs. Abernathy? That would be so kind of you. But I don't want to put you to any trouble." "Nonsense, dear," Mrs. Abernathy said, puffing up with importance. "It's no trouble at all. I'm happy to do my civic duty." Margaret handed her the note, thanking her profusely. She watched as Mrs. Abernathy tucked it into her handbag, a sense of relief washing over her. The serpent was in the garden, but it was carrying their message, their hope, to its destination. Margaret made sure to emphasize that she was to be out for the day and to not bother knocking, so that she would not be home when or if Ashton decided to pay her house a visit. As she walked away, Margaret couldn't help but smile. Mrs. Abernathy, the unwitting accomplice, the unlikely messenger, had become their secret weapon. The plan was in motion, a delicate game of deception that could determine their fate. But as she headed back, her house stood empty, and she had a creeping feeling that even that would not deter Thomas. Chapter 12. Scars of the Somme. The wait for Senator Thorne's response was agonizing. Margaret and Arthur remained holed up in her house, the silence punctuated by the ticking clock and the ever-present fear of discovery. They knew Ashton was out there, somewhere, hunting them, his betrayal a constant, gnawing ache. They spent the time reviewing their plan, going over every detail, trying to anticipate every possible contingency. They had to be prepared for anything, for any eventuality. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Arthur, despite his outward calm, was visibly affected by Ashton's treachery. He spoke little, his eyes haunted by the memories of their shared past, the camaraderie forged in the trenches of the Somme. "We were brothers, Margaret," he said, his voice low and strained. "We fought side by side. We saved each other's lives. We shared our fears, our hopes, our dreams. How could he do this? How could he betray everything we stood for?" Margaret had no answers. She could only offer him comfort, her presence a silent reassurance that he was not alone. She held his hand, her fingers intertwined with his, their shared touch a lifeline in the sea of uncertainty. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit parlor, Arthur began to talk about the war, about the horrors he had witnessed, the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. He spoke of the mud, the blood, the constant fear of death, the relentless shelling that shattered their nerves and their sanity. "The Somme," he said, his voice a distant whisper. "It was hell on earth, Margaret. A wasteland of death and despair. We lost so many good men, so many friends." He described a particular battle, a brutal, bloody encounter that had left him wounded, both physically and emotionally. He had been hit by shrapnel, his leg torn open, his body riddled with pain. He had lain there for hours, bleeding, waiting for death, the sounds of battle fading into a distant roar. "I thought it was over, Margaret," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought I was going to die. I closed my eyes and I saw your face. I saw our future, the life we had planned. And I prayed. I prayed for one more chance to see you again." He had been rescued, pulled from the mud by his comrades, carried to a field hospital, where he had undergone surgery, a painful, agonizing ordeal that had saved his life, but left him with a permanent limp, a constant reminder of the horrors he had endured. "Thomas was there," Arthur said, his voice hardening. "He was the one who found me. He dragged me to safety. He saved my life." He paused, his face contorted with a mixture of grief and anger. "And now he's the one trying to kill me. He's the one who wants to destroy everything we fought for." Margaret held him close, her arms around him, her tears mingling with his. She felt his pain, his anguish, his disillusionment. The scars of the psalm, she realized, were not just physical. They were emotional, psychological wounds that ran deep, that might never fully heal. She understood now, more than ever, the importance of their mission, the need to expose the truth, to bring the perpetrators to justice. It was not just about their own survival, their own happiness. It was about honoring the memory of those who had fallen, about fighting for a better world, a world free from war, from corruption, from betrayal. As the night wore on, they made a pact. They would not surrender. They would not be intimidated. They would fight to the bitter end, for their love, for their future, for the ideals they believed in. Suddenly, a noise from the hallway interrupted their pact. A soft scraping, like a key turning in a lock. They froze, their hearts pounding, their eyes fixed on the door. Arthur reached for the pistol he had hidden beneath a cushion, his hand steady, his eyes narrowed. He signaled Margaret to stay silent, to stay hidden. The door creaked open, slowly, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. It was not Ashton. It was a woman, her face obscured by the shadows. She held a small, silver object in her hand, something that glinted in the dim light. It was a key, and it was Margaret's spare house key, the one she hid under a flower pot near the front door. The woman stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. She saw Arthur, his pistol raised, his finger on the trigger. She froze, her eyes widening in fear. It was not an intruder. "Senator Thorne sent me. I have the reply," she whispered, the words shaking. She was just a messenger, not a warrior. She was there to help. Chapter 13. A Stolen Kiss in Georgetown. The young woman, a secretary from Senator Thorne's office, judging by her neat attire and nervous demeanor, stood frozen in the doorway, the spare key dangling from her trembling hand. The sight of Arthur, weapon drawn, had clearly shaken her. I have a message," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "From Senator Thorne. For Miss Collins." Arthur slowly lowered his pistol, his eyes still wary, his body tense. He motioned for Margaret to approach. Margaret stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I'm Margaret Collins," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "What's the message?" The woman held out a small, sealed envelope, her hand shaking. He said it was urgent, and that you should be careful." Margaret took the envelope, her fingers brushing against the woman's. She thanked her, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. The woman hesitated, then said, he said that Mr. Ashton has been asking questions. About you. And about the captain. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Ashton was closing in. He knew they were in contact with Senator Thorne. He was tightening the net. "Thank you," Margaret repeated, her voice barely audible. "You've been very helpful." The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She turned and fled, disappearing into the night as quickly as she had appeared. Margaret and Arthur retreated back into the parlor, locking the door behind them. They were alone again, the sealed envelope their only link to the outside world, their only hope for salvation. Margaret tore open the envelope, her hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Senator Thorne's familiar, elegant handwriting. The message was brief, concise, and chilling. "Ashton is aware of your communication. He is dangerous. Do not trust anyone. Meet me tomorrow, midnight, Lincoln Memorial. Bring the treaty. Be prepared to flee." Midnight. The Lincoln Memorial. A public place, yet secluded at that hour. A place where they could be seen, yet hidden in the shadows. It was a risky rendezvous, a dangerous gamble, but they had no other choice. "He knows," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Ashton knows we're working with Senator Thorne." Arthur nodded, his face grim. "He's one step ahead of us, Margaret. He's anticipating our every move."
"But how?"
she asked, her mind racing. "How could he know? We were so careful." Arthur paced the room, his hand running through his hair. "He has informants," he said. "Spies everywhere. In the government, in the military, even in Senator Thorne's office." The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. They were surrounded by enemies, betrayed by those they had trusted, their every move monitored, their every hope threatened. "What do we do, Arthur?" she asked, her voice filled with despair. "We can't trust anyone. We're trapped." He stopped pacing, his gaze meeting hers. He reached out, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, reassuring, a beacon of hope in the darkness. "We fight, Margaret," he said, his voice firm. "We fight for our lives, for our future, for the truth. We won't give up. We won't surrender." He pulled her close, his arms encircling her, holding her tight. She rested her head against his chest, her ear pressed against his heart, listening to the steady rhythm of his life. "I love you, Margaret," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "I've always loved you, and I'll always protect you." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, Arthur," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'll never leave your side." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers, a gentle, tender kiss that sealed their vow, their commitment, their unwavering love. It was a stolen kiss, a moment of intimacy snatched from the jaws of danger, a testament to their enduring bond. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate, a fusion of fear and desire, of longing and hope. It was a kiss that defied the darkness, that transcended the betrayal, that promised a future, however uncertain. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked together, their hearts beating as one. The world outside, with its dangers and uncertainties, faded away, replaced by the intimacy of their connection, the strength of their love. "We need to prepare," Arthur said, his voice regaining its urgency. "We have a meeting to attend, a treaty to deliver, and a fight to win." They spent the remaining hours preparing for the midnight rendezvous. They gathered their supplies, their weapons, their courage. They were ready to face the unknown, to confront their enemies, to fight for their freedom. As the clock struck 11, they left the house, disappearing into the night, their destination the Lincoln Memorial, their fate hanging in the balance. They walked with hushed steps through Georgetown, making sure that they were alone. The darkness held an eerie beauty, even in the face of all the danger. A stolen kiss, and a new hope. But what awaited them at the monument? Chapter 14. The Informant's Tale. The walk to the Lincoln Memorial was tense and silent. The city, usually bustling even at this late hour, felt deserted, the streets shrouded in an unnatural quiet, as if holding its breath, anticipating the coming confrontation. The moon, a sliver in the inky sky, offered little illumination, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them like specters. Arthur, ever vigilant, scanned their surroundings, his hand resting on the pistol concealed beneath his coat. Margaret clutched the waterproof packet containing the treaty, its weight a constant reminder of the stakes involved. As they approached the memorial, the towering figure of Lincoln, seated in his marble chair, loomed before them, a silent witness to their struggle, a symbol of hope and resilience in a nation grappling with its own demons. The area around the reflecting pool was deserted, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the stone. They moved cautiously, their eyes searching the shadows, their ears straining for any sign of danger. They found Senator Thorne waiting for them near the steps of the memorial, his tall figure silhouetted against the dimly lit interior. He was alone, as requested, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that they were being watched. "Senator Thorne," Arthur said, his voice low but firm. "We're here." The senator turned, his face etched with concern. "Miss Collins, Captain Gray," he said, his voice grave. "Thank you for coming. I know this is a risk, but it's a risk we have to take." He gestured towards the steps. "Let's go inside. We can talk more freely there." They followed him into the memorial, the vast space echoing with their footsteps. The statue of Lincoln, bathed in a soft, ethereal light, seemed to gaze down upon them, a silent guardian of their hopes and fears. "I have news," Senator Thorne said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Bad news, I'm afraid. Ashton is closer than we thought." He has sources within my own office. Margaret's heart sank. She had suspected as much, but the confirmation was still a blow. They were surrounded by enemies, their every move compromised. How do you know? Arthur asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Senator Thorne sighed, his face etched with weariness. I received an anonymous tip, he said. A message, left on my desk this evening. It warned me about Ashton, about his connection to the conspiracy, about his pursuit of you both. An anonymous tip? Margaret said, her voice skeptical. Can we trust it? The senator nodded. I believe so. The message contained details that only someone with intimate knowledge of my office, of my staff, could have known. And the person provided an additional warning. It was about he reached and took hold of Margaret's arm, looking at her with genuine concern. They said that you are in the most danger, Margaret. Ashton wants you. More than anything. Be vigilant. A chill went up her spine. Arthur stepped forward, instinctively shielding Margaret. Who is this informant, Senator? Can we reach them, talk to them? The senator shook his head. It will not be possible. The informant cannot risk exposure. Margaret had a thought. The woman, the secretary. The one who brought the letter.
Do you think?
It is possible, the senator admitted. It is a risk, but it would make sense. He sighed, leaning against one of the large stone pillars. We must move fast and cautiously. I will work with my contacts in the Justice Department.
But for now.
He took the treaty from Margaret's hand, his grip firm. This will be safer with me. They agreed, a moment of silence passing between them as the weight of their shared secret, their shared danger, settled upon them. They had an ally in Senator Thorne, but even he was vulnerable, surrounded by potential enemies. The weight of the world seemed to be on them, there in the presence of Abraham Lincoln. It was time to find out who this informant was and what danger they could all be in. Chapter 15. Midnight at the Lincoln Memorial. With the treaty now in Senator Thorne's possession, a fragile sense of security settled over the small group. However, the revelation of an informant within Thorne's office, coupled with the heightened threat against Margaret, cast a long shadow over their plans. We need to identify this informant, Arthur said, his voice low and determined. They could be our key to understanding Ashton's network, to exposing this conspiracy. Senator Thorne nodded in agreement. I've already initiated an internal investigation, but it's a delicate process. I can't risk alerting Ashton or his allies. We need to be discreet, methodical. The secretary, Margaret said, her mind replaying the encounter earlier that evening. The woman who delivered your message. She seemed frightened, and she knew about Ashton asking questions. Senator Thorne considered this. It's possible, he said. She's a relatively new employee, a young woman named Sarah Miller. She's been efficient, reliable, but I haven't had much personal interaction with her. We need to talk to her, Margaret said, her voice firm. But we can't approach her directly. Ashton might be watching her, waiting for her to lead him to us. They discussed various options, weighing the risks and benefits of each approach. They needed a way to contact Sarah Miller without alerting Ashton, a way to gain her trust, to convince her to share what she knew. I have an idea, Arthur said, his eyes gleaming with a spark of inspiration. The Lincoln Memorial. It's a public place, frequented by tourists, visitors, government employees. We could arrange a chance encounter, a seemingly accidental meeting.
He proposed a plan.
Margaret would visit the memorial during the day, posing as a tourist, sketching the statue of Lincoln. Arthur would be nearby, observing, providing protection. They would wait for Sarah Miller to appear, hoping that she might visit the memorial during her lunch break, a common practice for government employees working nearby. If she appeared, Margaret would approach her, subtly, cautiously, using a code phrase that Senator Thorne would provide, a signal that she was a trusted ally. It was a risky plan, a gamble, but it was their best chance to gain access to the informant, to unravel the web of deceit that surrounded them. The next day, Margaret and Arthur put the plan into action. Margaret arrived at the memorial early, armed with a sketchbook and pencils, posing as a tourist. She chose a spot near the steps, offering a clear view of the entrance and the reflecting pool. Arthur positioned himself across the way, pretending to read, but watching Margaret, ever vigilant, scanning the crowd for the enemy. The hours passed slowly, the sun climbing high in the sky, the memorial filling with visitors. Margaret sketched, her hand moving automatically, her mind focused on the task ahead. She felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, her senses on high alert. Then, around noon, she saw her. Sarah Miller, the young secretary, walking towards the memorial, her head down, her shoulders slumped, her face etched with worry. She looked like a woman carrying a heavy burden, a secret that threatened to consume her. Margaret's heart pounded. This was it, the moment of truth. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She waited for Sarah to approach, to get closer, before making her move. As Sarah passed by, Margaret pretended to drop her sketchbook, letting it fall to the ground near Sarah's feet. "Oh dear," Margaret exclaimed, feigning embarrassment. "How clumsy of me." Sarah stopped, startled. She bent down to pick up the sketchbook, her eyes meeting Margaret's. Margaret seized the opportunity. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and steady. I seem to be all thumbs today." She paused, then said the code phrase, the words carefully chosen by Senator Thorne. "The emancipation is a heavy burden to bear, isn't it?" Sarah's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, of understanding, crossing her face. She hesitated, then said, her voice barely a whisper, yes, it is." It was the confirmation. Sarah Miller was the informant. Margaret gestured towards a nearby bench. Would you mind sitting with me for a moment?" she asked. "I could use some company." Sarah hesitated again, then nodded. She sat down beside Margaret, her body tense, her eyes darting nervously around. "I know who you are," Margaret said, her voice low and reassuring. "Senator Thorne told us about you, about the message you left." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so scared. But I couldn't let them get away with it." She began to talk, her words tumbling out in a rush, a torrent of fear, guilt, and desperation. She described Ashton's activities, his clandestine meetings, his whispered conversations, his manipulation of Senator Thorne's office. He's not who he seems," Sarah said, her voice shaking. He's a monster. He's using the senator, using all of us, to achieve his own goals." She revealed that Ashton had been pressuring her, threatening her, trying to get information about Margaret and Arthur, about their communication with Senator Thorne. "He knows about the treaty," Sarah said. "He knows you have it, and he'll stop at nothing to get it back." Margaret listened intently, her mind racing, absorbing every detail, every clue. Sarah Miller was a valuable ally, a courageous young woman who had risked everything to expose the truth. Just as she was speaking, Arthur appeared from the shadows. He was cautious, but the signal had been given. Margaret began to explain what they had been doing and where they had been, and slowly, she began to trust them too. They had an informant, a plan, and now an ally. But was it enough? Chapter 16. The Weight of Revelation. With Sarah Miller's confirmation as the informant, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a conspiracy far more intricate and dangerous than Margaret and Arthur had initially imagined. Sarah's tale, shared in hushed whispers beneath the watchful gaze of Lincoln's statue, painted a chilling picture of Ashton's treachery and the extent of his network. "He's been using Senator Thorne's office as a hub," Sarah explained, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and indignation. "He has access to classified information, to communication channels, to everything." She described how Ashton had cultivated relationships with key members of Thorne's staff, manipulating them, bribing them, even threatening them, to gain their cooperation. He had created a web of informants, a network of spies who reported directly to him, feeding him information, carrying out his orders. "He's been planning this for years," Sarah said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He's been patiently building his power, his influence, waiting for the right moment to strike." The right moment, she revealed, was the upcoming election. Senator Thorne was a leading candidate for a prominent position in the new administration, a position that would give him significant influence over foreign policy, over military affairs. Ashton, Sarah explained, intended to use Thorne's position to advance his own agenda, to manipulate government policy, to enrich himself and his allies. The secret treaty, she believed, was a key part of his plan, a leverage point he could use to control Thorne, to blackmail him, to force him to comply with his demands. He wants to control the government, Margaret, she said, to bend them to his purpose, so he can line his pockets with money and gain more influence. Margaret felt a surge of anger, of outrage, at the audacity of Ashton's scheme. He was not just a traitor, he was a threat to democracy, a cancer eating away at the foundations of the nation. We need to stop him, Margaret said, her voice firm with determination. We need to expose his conspiracy, to bring him to justice. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. I'll help you, she said. I'll do whatever I can. I have access to certain files, to documents that could prove his guilt. They discussed a plan. Sarah would gather evidence, discreetly, cautiously, copying documents, recording conversations, anything that could shed light on Ashton's activities. She would then pass the information to Margaret and Arthur, using a secure drop-off point, a location where they could retrieve it without being detected. It was a dangerous undertaking, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, but they had no other choice. They were running out of time, the election looming, Ashton's plan nearing fruition. As they were about to part, Sarah revealed one final, crucial piece of information. There's someone else involved, she said, her voice hesitant. Someone higher up. Someone even more powerful than Ashton. Margaret and Arthur exchanged a look of shock. They had assumed Ashton was the mastermind, the driving force behind the conspiracy. But now, it seemed, he was just a pawn in a larger game, a puppet controlled by a hidden hand. Who? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who is it? Sarah hesitated, her eyes filled with fear. I don't know his name, she said. But I've heard them call him the architect. He's the one who orchestrated everything. He's the one who gave Ashton his orders. The architect. A shadowy figure, lurking in the background, pulling the strings, manipulating events, controlling the fate of nations. The revelation added a new layer of complexity, of danger, to their mission. They parted ways, Margaret and Arthur returning to their hideout, Sarah returning to Senator Thorne's office, each carrying a heavy burden of responsibility, of fear, and of determination. The weight of revelation, Margaret realized, was not just the knowledge of the conspiracy, but the understanding of its scope, its depth, its insidious reach into the highest echelons of power. They were not just fighting Ashton, they were fighting a system, a network of corruption that threatened to engulf them all. They returned to their temporary safe house, weary and more than a little shaken, but with a renewed sense of purpose.
Who was this architect?
The name lingered like a bad taste in their mouths. We'll figure this out, Arthur declared. And, for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a new sliver of hope. Chapter 17. Across the Potomac. The revelation of the architect, a shadowy figure orchestrating the conspiracy from behind the scenes, cast a long shadow over their plans. They knew they were facing an enemy far more powerful and elusive than Ashton, a puppet master pulling the strings of their fate. They spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, waiting for Sarah Miller's promised evidence, their nerves frayed, their trust eroded. They moved cautiously, avoiding contact with anyone outside their small circle, their world shrinking to the confines of their hideout. One evening, as they sat huddled together, poring over maps of Washington, searching for clues, for connections, for any sign of the architect's influence, Arthur spoke of his growing unease. I don't like this, Margaret, he said, his voice low and troubled. We're too exposed here. We're sitting ducks, waiting for Ashton or the architect to make their move. He pointed to the map, his finger tracing the contours of the Potomac River, the boundary between Washington, D.C. and Virginia. We need to get out of the city, he said. We need to find a place where we can be safe, where we can regroup, where we can plan our next move.
He proposed a daring plan.
They would cross the Potomac, seeking refuge in the quiet countryside of Virginia, far from the prying eyes of Ashton and his network. It was a risky proposition, a journey into the unknown, but it was their best chance to escape the immediate danger, to gain some breathing room. Margaret hesitated. Leaving Washington meant leaving Senator Thorne, their only ally in the government, their only link to the investigation. But she knew Arthur was right. They were too vulnerable, too exposed in the city. "Where would we go?" she asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Arthur pointed to a small, unmarked spot on the map, a cluster of houses nestled along the banks of the Potomac, just across the river from Washington. "There," he said, "a small village called Oakhaven. It's remote, secluded, far from the main roads. It's a place where we can disappear, for a while at least." They made preparations for their departure, gathering supplies, packing their belongings, preparing for a journey into the unknown. They would travel under cover of darkness, using a small, borrowed boat, navigating the treacherous currents of the Potomac, hoping to reach the other side undetected. As they prepared to leave, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the sense that they were being watched, that their every move was being monitored. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the darkened streets, searching for any sign of pursuit. Suddenly she saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow shifting in the alleyway across the street. It was too quick, too fleeting, to be sure, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice urgent. I think someone's out there." Arthur joined her at the window, his eyes narrowed, his hand reaching for his pistol. He scanned the alleyway, his gaze piercing the darkness. "I don't see anything," he said, his voice low. "But you're right. We need to go. Now." They left the house quickly, silently, moving like shadows through the darkened streets. They reached the riverbank, finding the small boat hidden amongst the reeds, just as planned. They boarded the boat, Arthur taking the oars, Margaret clutching the bag containing their meager belongings. The river was dark, ominous, the current swift and treacherous. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a beacon of civilization, but also a symbol of the danger they were fleeing. As they rowed across the Potomac, Margaret felt a sense of liberation, of escape, but also a sense of vulnerability, of being adrift in a vast, unknown expanse. The river, a boundary between two worlds, represented their own journey, their transition from a life of quiet desperation to a life of uncertain freedom. They were going to need to leave the country. That much was clear, but where would they go? And how would they get there without being noticed? The boat sliced through the water, carrying them closer to their new life. Chapter 18. The Unveiling of Secrets. The crossing of the Potomac under cover of darkness was a harrowing experience. The current was strong, the wind whipped against their faces, and the fear of discovery gnawed at their insides. But Arthur's strength and determination, coupled with Margaret's unwavering support, propelled them forward, carrying them towards the relative safety of the Virginia shore. They reached Oakhaven just before dawn, the small village shrouded in mist, the houses dark and silent, their inhabitants still asleep. It was a world away from the bustling streets of Washington, a haven of peace and tranquility, at least on the surface. They found a secluded cabin, nestled among the trees, overlooking the river. It was rustic, sparsely furnished, but it offered them shelter, privacy, and a sense of temporary security. They settled in, exhaustion washing over them, the adrenaline of their escape slowly fading. They spent the next few days in a state of quiet vigilance, resting, recovering, and waiting for Sarah Miller's promised evidence. They explored the surrounding countryside, walking along the riverbank, breathing in the fresh air, finding solace in the beauty of nature. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over the Potomac, a small, battered car pulled up to the cabin, kicking up dust. A figure emerged, their face obscured by the shadows of the trees. Margaret's heart pounded. It was Sarah. She was alone, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She carried a large, bulky envelope, its contents heavy with the secrets she had risked her life to obtain. "I have it," she said, her voice trembling. "I have the evidence. But it's worse than we thought." They ushered her inside, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Sarah spread the contents of the envelope on the rough wooden table, revealing a collection of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. It was a damning indictment of Ashton's treachery, a detailed record of his clandestine activities, his manipulation of Senator Thorne's office, his connection to the secret treaty. But it was more than that. It was a revelation of a deeper, more sinister conspiracy, a web of corruption that reached far beyond Ashton, far beyond Washington. The documents implicated high-ranking officials, prominent businessmen, even members of the diplomatic corps. They revealed a network of influence, a shadow government operating in secret, manipulating events, controlling policies, enriching themselves at the expense of the nation. And at the center of it all was the architect. Sarah had uncovered his identity, his real name, a name that sent a chill down Margaret's spine, a name that shattered their illusions, their beliefs, their trust in the institutions they had once held sacred. The architect was none other than General Douglas Macready, a decorated war hero, a respected public figure, a man considered to be a pillar of the establishment. He was Arthur's uncle. Arthur stared at the documents, his face ashen, his eyes filled with disbelief, with a profound sense of betrayal. He stumbled back, as if struck by a physical blow, his hand clutching his chest. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It can't be. Not Uncle Douglas." Margaret went to him, putting her arms around him, holding him tight. She felt his pain, his anguish, his shattered illusions. The man he had admired, respected, looked up to, was a traitor, a criminal, the mastermind behind the conspiracy that had destroyed their lives. I don't understand," Arthur stammered, his voice choked with emotion. He was a hero. He fought for his country. He saved my father's life during the war." Sarah explained that General Macready's heroism, his reputation, was a carefully constructed facade, a mask that concealed a ruthless, ambitious, power-hungry man. He had used his military career, his connections, his influence, to build a secret empire, a network of corruption that spanned continents. The secret treaty, she revealed, was just one small part of his grand scheme, a tool he had used to manipulate governments, to instigate conflicts, to profit from the chaos of war. He was a merchant of death, a master manipulator, a man who believed he was above the law, above morality, above humanity. Margaret went to Arthur and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We have to stop him." But a new emotion flickered across Arthur's face. Betrayal. Rage. It was not just a mission now. It was personal. Chapter 19. Atonement in the Rain. The revelation of General Macready's identity as the architect was a devastating blow, particularly for Arthur. The man he had idolized, the man who had been a father figure to him after his own father's death, was a traitor, a criminal mastermind. The weight of that betrayal threatened to crush him. Margaret and Sarah watched helplessly as Arthur grappled with the shocking truth, his emotions ranging from disbelief to anger to a profound sense of loss. He paced the cabin, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and fury. "I trusted him, Margaret," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I looked up to him. He was everything I aspired to be." Margaret went to him, putting her arms around him, offering him comfort, solace, a silent reassurance that he was not alone in his grief, in his rage. "I know, Arthur," she said, her voice soft. "I know it hurts, but we can't let him win. We have to stop him." They knew they had to act quickly. With the evidence Sarah had provided, they had a chance to expose Macready, to bring him to justice, to dismantle his network of corruption. But they also knew that he was a powerful, dangerous man, with resources and connections that far exceeded their own. They decided to return to Washington, to present the evidence to Senator Thorne, to enlist his help in bringing Macready down. It was a risky proposition, a journey back into the heart of danger, but they had no other choice. They left Oak Haven under cover of darkness, once again crossing the Potomac, this time with the weight of their discovery, their determination, their shared sense of purpose, propelling them forward. They reached Washington just as a storm broke, the rain lashing against the streets, the wind howling like a banshee. It was a fitting backdrop to their mission, a reflection of the turmoil within their hearts, the storm of emotions that raged within them. They went directly to Senator Thorne's residence, bypassing his office, knowing that it was compromised, that McCrady's spies were likely watching their every move. They found the senator alone, in his study, his face etched with worry, with the burden of the secrets he carried. He listened intently as they presented the evidence, Sarah's documents, Arthur's testimony, the damning proof of McCrady's treachery. Senator Thorne was shocked, appalled, but not entirely surprised. He had long suspected that something was amiss, that there was a hidden hand manipulating events, controlling the government from behind the scenes. "McCrady," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "I should have known. He was always too ambitious, too ruthless, too eager to please. He agreed to help them, to use his influence, his connections, to bring McCrady to justice. But he warned them that it would be a difficult, dangerous battle, that McCrady would not go down without a fight. He has powerful allies, powerful friends," Senator Thorne said. "He will use every resource at his disposal to protect himself, to silence you." They knew the risks, but they were prepared to face them. They had come too far, lost too much, to turn back now. As they were about to leave, to put their plan into action, Arthur turned to Senator Thorne, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "There's one more thing, Senator," he said. I need to confront him. I need to face him, to make him answer for his crimes." It was a reckless, dangerous idea, but Margaret understood. Arthur needed closure. He needed to confront the man who had betrayed him, who had shattered his illusions, who had destroyed his family. Senator Thorne hesitated, then nodded. "I understand, Arthur," he said. "But be careful. He's a dangerous man. He won't hesitate to kill you." Arthur and Margaret left the senator's residence, stepping out into the storm, the rain washing over them, cleansing them, preparing them for the final confrontation. They went to McCrady's estate, a grand, imposing mansion on the outskirts of Washington, a symbol of his power, his wealth, his corrupt influence. The rain was coming down in sheets. They approached the house cautiously, their senses on high alert. They knew that McCrady would be expecting them, that he would be prepared, that he would have guards, security, defenses in place. As they neared the entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by the darkness, his hand holding a gun. It was General McCrady. "Arthur," McCrady said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. "I knew you'd come. I've been waiting for you." Arthur stepped forward, his own pistol drawn, his eyes locked with McCrady's. "It's over, Uncle Douglas," Arthur said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "We know everything. We have the evidence. You're finished." McCrady chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You think so, Arthur? You think you can defeat me? You're just a boy, playing a man's game." "I'm not afraid of you," Arthur said, his voice firm. "I'm not the boy you once knew. I'm a man, and I'm here to bring you to justice." The rain continued to fall, washing away the dirt, the grime, the lies, revealing the truth, the raw, brutal truth of McCrady's betrayal. "You were never a hero," Arthur shouted over the sounds of the wind and rain. "You used my father. You were a coward." McCrady's face contorted in rage. He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You dare," but before he could fire, Arthur fired first. A single shot, echoing through the stormy night. McCrady stumbled, his eyes widening in disbelief, his hand clutching his chest. He fell to the ground, his body limp, his lifeblood staining the rain-soaked pavement. It was over. The architect was dead. The conspiracy was exposed. Justice, at least in part, had been served. Margaret rushed to Arthur's side, her arms encircling him, holding him tight. He stood there, trembling, the pistol still in his hand, his eyes fixed on McCrady's lifeless body. "It's over, love. It's over," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear. But even as she spoke the words, a great clap of thunder came, and flashes of lightning illuminated the area. Arthur had found atonement in the rain, but he was not sure what was next. Chapter 20. The Dawn of Forgiveness. The storm raged on, mirroring the tempest within Arthur's soul. The death of his uncle, the man who had been both mentor and betrayer, left him reeling with a complex mix of grief, relief, and a profound sense of emptiness. The rain washed over him, cleansing him of the blood, the guilt, the weight of the past. Margaret held him close, her presence a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of his emotions. She understood the depth of his pain, the shattering of his illusions, the loss of the man he had once admired. Senator Thorne arrived soon after, accompanied by federal agents, the scene quickly secured, the wheels of justice set in motion. Macready's death, while a necessary act of self-defense, would require investigation, explanation, the unraveling of a complex web of deceit. Arthur cooperated fully, providing a detailed account of the events, the conspiracy, the evidence they had gathered. He knew he had acted in self-defense, that he had done what was necessary to protect himself, Margaret, and the nation, but the weight of his actions, the taking of a life, even the life of a traitor, weighed heavily upon him. In the days that followed, the news of Macready's death and the exposure of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through Washington, through the nation, through the world. The story dominated the headlines, the intricate details of the plot, the identities of the conspirators, the extent of their corruption, revealed in a series of explosive revelations. Senator Thorne played a crucial role in the investigation, using his influence, his connections, to ensure that justice was served, that the guilty were brought to account. Sarah Miller, her bravery and integrity recognized, was offered protection, a chance to rebuild her life, free from the shadow of fear. Arthur and Margaret retreated from the public eye, seeking solace in their shared love, in the quiet countryside of Virginia. They returned to the cabin in Oakhaven, their temporary refuge, their sanctuary from the storm. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The wounds of the past began to heal, slowly, gradually, replaced by a sense of peace, of closure, of a future filled with hope. Arthur, though still haunted by the memory of his uncle, by the betrayal he had endured, found solace in Margaret's unwavering love, in her strength, her compassion, her unwavering belief in him. One sunny morning, as they sat on the porch of the cabin, overlooking the tranquil waters of the Potomac, Arthur spoke of his plans, his desire to move forward, to build a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past. "I want to leave, Margaret," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "I want to leave Washington, leave the memories, leave the ghosts behind. I want to start over, somewhere new, somewhere peaceful." Margaret smiled, her eyes filled with love, with understanding. "Where would you like to go?"
she asked.
He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I don't know," he said. Somewhere far away. Somewhere we can be together, just the two of us. Somewhere we can build a home, a family, a future." They decided to travel, to explore the world, to find a place where they could truly belong, a place where they could heal, where they could build a life together, free from the burdens of the past. They sold Margaret's house in Georgetown, severing their ties to Washington, to the memories, to the pain. They packed their belongings, their few possessions, their hopes, their dreams, and set off on a journey, a pilgrimage of healing, of discovery, of forgiveness. They traveled across the country, across the ocean, exploring new lands, new cultures, new possibilities. They found solace in the beauty of nature, in the kindness of strangers, in the shared experience of building a new life together. And as they traveled, they began to heal. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the losses they had endured, but they no longer defined them. They were survivors, not victims. They were lovers, partners, soulmates, bound together by a love that had endured the darkness, that had emerged stronger, more resilient, more profound. They eventually found their place, their sanctuary, a small, peaceful village nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside, far from the turmoil of Washington, far from the shadows of the past. They built a home, a life, a family. They found peace, happiness, and a love that would endure, a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity, that had been tested by betrayal, that had emerged triumphant, a beacon of hope in a world filled with darkness. They knew they were lucky, blessed even. So many had lost everything in the Great War. They had managed, somehow, to come out on the other side. They had their love, and they had their hope. And they were together, free from shadows. Epilogue. Years passed, the seasons turning, the world changing, but Margaret and Arthur's love remained a constant, a beacon of hope and resilience in a world still grappling with the aftermath of war and the ever-present threat of conflict. They settled into their new life in the English countryside, their small cottage a haven of peace and tranquility, far from the bustling streets of Washington, far from the shadows of their past. They had children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up surrounded by love, by stories of courage and resilience, by the enduring beauty of the English countryside. Arthur found work as a writer, his experiences in the war, his knowledge of espionage and intrigue, providing him with a wealth of material for his novels, which became popular on both sides of the Atlantic. Margaret, ever the artist, continued to paint, her canvases filled with the vibrant colors of the English landscape, the rolling hills, the ancient forests, the tranquil streams. Her art became a reflection of their new life, a celebration of their love, their family, their newfound peace. They never forgot the past, the sacrifices they had made, the battles they had fought, the friends they had lost. They kept the memory of those who had fallen alive, honoring their courage, their dedication, their unwavering commitment to justice. Senator Thorne remained a lifelong friend, a frequent visitor to their home in England, his letters filled with news of Washington, of the ongoing struggle for peace and democracy. Sarah Miller, the courageous young secretary who had risked her life to expose the conspiracy, also kept in touch, her letters filled with gratitude, with updates on her new life, her marriage, her growing family. Arthur never fully reconciled with the memory of his uncle, General Macready. The betrayal still stung, the wound still festered, but he learned to live with it, to accept it as a part of his past, a reminder of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of even the most respected institutions. One autumn afternoon, as Margaret and Arthur sat on the porch of their cottage, watching their grandchildren play in the garden, the sun setting over the rolling hills, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Margaret turned to Arthur, her eyes filled with love, with gratitude. "We made it, Arthur," she said, her voice soft. "We survived. We found our peace." Arthur smiled, his hand reaching for hers, his fingers intertwining with hers, their touch still carrying the spark of their enduring love. "Yes, Margaret," he said. "We did. We found our peace. And we found it together." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with gratitude, with contentment, with the quiet joy of a life well lived, a love that had endured, a future filled with promise. The shadows of the past had receded, replaced by the warm glow of the setting sun, the promise of a new dawn, a new beginning, a future filled with hope, with forgiveness, with the enduring power of love. The scars remained, but they were a testament to their strength, their resilience, their unwavering commitment to each other, to their family, to a world free from darkness. The future was bright, and they were free. The end.